We'd like to think we've mapped out the story of humanity, but the truth is, we are standing on a graveyard of forgotten civilizations. For decades, these stories were dismissed as myths or pseudo-history, but today, the ground is literally giving up its secrets. We found high-precision machines built 2,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. We found alien-looking empires that were wiped from the history books, and we found the chemical fingerprints of a global catastrophe that almost ended us all. We aren't guessing anymore. We have the DNA. We have the satellite scans. We have the artifacts. Today, we're looking at the top 10 ancient mysteries with real, undeniable evidence. And before we begin our journey, I'd love to know where you're joining us from and what time it is for you right now. I always read the comments. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Let me know below. On a bare limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, there's a place that looks quiet from a distance. Then you realize the ground is hiding architecture on a scale that doesn't fit the usual early Neolithic story. Göbekli Tepe dates to the pre-pottery Neolithic, roughly the 10th to 9th millennium BCE. Once the soil is peeled back, the main evidence is impossible to ignore. Huge T-shaped stone pillars rise out of carefully planned circular enclosures. Some stand over 5 meters tall. Many are carved with animals and with symbols that feel like a language we can't quite read. For a long time, the site's best-known excavator, Klaus Schmidt, argued this had to be a special-purpose ritual center. In his view, people came here for ceremonies and feasts, then left. The reason was simple. The monumental circles dominate the hilltop, and the classic signs of dense, everyday village life seemed thin in comparison. That interpretation made the site a plot twist. It suggested shared belief and ritual could organize big groups before farming and settled life fully locked in. Then the picture got more complicated. Newer work has pushed back against the clean, temple-only idea. Recent excavation updates from the team emphasize signs consistent with domestic activity as well as longer-term use of the hill. In other words, the place may not have been just a stage people visited. Some areas look like they belonged to daily routines: work, storage, food processing, and possibly living, at least in certain periods or seasons. That shift doesn't kill the mystery, it deepens it. Instead of a lonely shrine, Göbekli Tepe starts to feel like a settlement with a powerful ritual core. It's closer to a sacred neighborhood than a single monument. And if people were spending real time up there, one practical question jumps out: water. The plateau is high and exposed. The project's own field notes discuss rock-cut features that may have served as cisterns. They also described carved channels that support the idea of rainwater collection. It's not glamorous evidence, but it matters. You don't keep returning to a place like this without solving basic logistics, especially not if you're feeding work crews and moving stone. So the evidence points in two directions at once. The monumental enclosures still look like spaces built for something bigger than private family life. At the same time, the surrounding features hint that daily life wasn't absent. It may have been spread out, seasonal, or simply harder to read. That combination reshapes the bigger question about the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. If Göbekli Tepe is both home and sanctuary, it doesn't neatly prove that religion came first or farming came first. What it does show is that social complexity came early, planning came early, shared symbols came early. Many researchers think the site captures communities in the middle of experimentation. They gather often, they build big, they process food, they manage resources, They create shared identities that can hold people together beyond one small band. Even the way the structures ended up filled and covered is part of the debate. The older popular story says the enclosures were deliberately buried, like a planned shutdown. Newer work on site formation suggests a messier reality. Some infilling may reflect collapse, erosion, and sediments moving down slope over time. Human activity and natural processes may have worked together. This is one of those cases where archaeology runs two mysteries at once. What did people intend, and what did the landscape do afterward? The picture is getting sharper, but it's not settled. Still, the takeaway is solid. Very early communities invested enormous labor into carved stone monuments. They did it in a place that also shows practical systems and traces of daily life. And that blend of the sacred and the lived-in is exactly why Göbekli Tepe still feels like the dawn of something bigger than architecture alone. Picture a storm, so loud and abrasive it doesn't just batter a coastline, it edits history. And in the Orkney Islands off Scotland, one violent blast of sand did exactly that. Skara Brae was occupied for centuries, roughly from 3180 to 2500 BCE, which makes it older than Stonehenge and older than the Great Pyramids at Giza. And what's eerie is how familiar it feels once you step into it. This isn't a scatter of stones and guesses. It's a neighborhood with rooms you can read, because the walls stand low and solid. And inside those rooms, the furniture is still there, built from stone, as if someone planned for time itself to be the enemy. You can see bed platforms, you can see shelves, you can see a central hearth where light would have flickered on wet rock in the winter. And then there's the detail that turns it from old village into time capsule, the engineering. Underfoot, Skara Brae has drainage channels and stone-lined passages that handled wastewater and kept living spaces drier than you'd expect for a settlement this early, in a place where wind and rain don't negotiate. The homes also connect through low, roofed passages, which makes the whole village feel less like separate houses and more like a single organism built to move people safely through brutal weather. The best evidence isn't a single treasure, it's the everyday order of the place, the way the rooms repeat a pattern, the way the doorways connect, the way storage spaces and work areas make sense when you imagine real people moving through them. That's also why the discovery story matters. Skara Brae didn't survive because it was forgotten in a desert. It survived because the sand arrived like a lid, sealing structures fast enough to protect them from centuries of scavenging and rebuilding. It's easy to romanticize that, like nature chose to preserve a message for us, but the more grounded truth is still remarkable. A sandstorm created a kind of accidental archive, and when later storms stripped the covering away, a whole slice of Stone Age life was sitting there, intact enough to make the past feel uncomfortably close. The mystery isn't whether the village existed, it's what it tells us about people we still underestimate. Why build so carefully? Why standardize your rooms? Why invest in stone furniture and water management unless you're thinking long-term, unless you expect to stay, unless you have rules, habits, and maybe even a sense of what a good life is supposed to look like? Skara Brae doesn't give us names or voices, but it gives us something just as hard to fake, the physical blueprint of daily life, preserved with a clarity that makes you realize how sophisticated simple can be. Deep in western China, the Tarim Basin is the kind of place that doesn't forgive mistakes. A vast desert where heat, salt, and dry air can erase a body fast, or sometimes preserve it with unnerving precision. That's why the mummies found there hit so hard when they were first studied closely, because they don't look like the neat, wrapped Egyptian idea of a mummy. They look like people who could sit up and start talking. Hair, clothing, facial contours, even the texture of textiles, so much survives that you can't treat them as abstract remains. And then comes the detail that sparked decades of argument. Some of these individuals show West Eurasian-looking features, found far from where many people assumed such features should appear in that era, in graves that can date back to the early 2nd millennium BCE and even earlier, depending on the cemetery. One site in particular became almost iconic, the Xiaohe Cemetery, where archaeologists uncovered the so-called beauty of Xiaohe, preserved so vividly that it's hard to remember you're looking at someone who lived thousands of years ago. Xiaohe also gives the story one of its most haunting visuals, because many burials there were placed inside wooden boats, flipped upside down and sometimes covered with hide, creating this surreal image of vessels stranded in sand, like a fleet stranded far from any sea. The evidence starts with the physical preservation, but it doesn't end there. The clothing includes woven wool and patterns that feel at home in steppe and temperate worlds, not just in an oasis on the edge of a desert. Burial goods suggest communities with their own habits and identities, not just anonymous travelers passing through. And the setting matters. The Tarim Basin sits between mountain ranges and trade corridors, a natural funnel that later becomes part of what people call the Silk Road, so it's a perfect place for human stories to overlap, mix, and collide. For years, the conversation around these mummies drifted into easy shortcuts, as if one look at a face could solve a migration map. But the modern approach has been more careful and more revealing. Genomic work published in 2021 added a sharp new layer. At least some of the earliest Tarim Basin individuals studied formed a distinctive genetic profile with deep local roots and limited signs of recent mixture, even while their material culture shows connections and influences that seem to come from far beyond the desert. That combination is the real mystery with real evidence, because it forces two truths to sit in the same room. On one hand, the DNA suggests a population that wasn't simply a wave of newcomers replacing locals. On the other hand, the objects, the textiles, and the broader regional context still point to contact, exchange, and cultural blending across Inner Asia. So the question shifts from who were they really to something more interesting. How does a community end up culturally plugged into a wide world while remaining, in genetic terms, surprisingly distinct? Maybe people moved ideas more than they moved in mass. Maybe small groups, marriages, and specialist knowledge left bigger cultural footprints than raw headcount would suggest. Maybe the desert oases acted like magnets, pulling in skills and styles, while the core population stayed relatively stable. Researchers still disagree on the details, and there's plenty of debate about which cemeteries represent which groups and which periods, but the direction of the evidence is clear enough to be exciting. The Tarim mummies aren't just a spooky preservation story, they're a case study in how early Eurasia worked, messy and connected, where identity could be local and foreign at the same time. One of the most vivid windows into Punt isn't a dusty line of text, it's a wall you can stand in front of, because the story is carved in stone at Deir el-Bahri, in the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. The reliefs there don't treat Punt like a vague rumor, they treat it like a destination with a plan. Ships set out, Crews return, goods are inventoried, and the whole thing is presented as a proud, organized achievement. You see lists of riches that mattered in Egypt's ritual economy: incense, resins, exotic wood, animals, and it's all framed as the kind of trade that feeds both religion and royal legitimacy. And then there's a detail that almost feels too cinematic to be real, except it's right there in the imagery. The Egyptians are shown digging up whole myrrh trees with their roots intact and hauling them back in baskets or tubs like living cargo, not just bags of resin. That matters because it suggests a specific goal that goes beyond shopping. They weren't only importing incense, they were trying to transplant the source itself, to grow Punt's sacred plants on Egyptian soil. The mystery, for a long time, was where Punt actually was. Scholars debated the Red Sea coasts, the Horn of Africa, southern Arabia, and mixed routes, because ancient trade doesn't always map on to modern geography. Then a different kind of evidence joined the argument, and it's the kind you can measure. Ancient Egyptians sometimes mummified animals, including baboons, and baboons weren't just curiosities, they carried religious symbolism and status, which makes them plausible imports from a place like Punt. The crucial point is that animals absorb their landscape. Isotopic signatures in teeth and bones reflect the water they drank and the geology around them while they were growing up, like a natural passport written in chemistry. When researchers analyzed isotopes from ancient mummified baboons and compared them with modern baseline data, the best match pointed toward the Horn of Africa, especially the region around today's Eritrea and Ethiopia, as the likely origin for at least some of those animals. It doesn't prove Punt was a single dot forever, because names can shift and trading zones can stretch, but it does anchor the legend to a real ecological region across the Red Sea. It also forces a more respectful view of Egyptian seafaring. Moving live baboons and uprooted trees across that distance isn't a casual expedition. It implies routes, timing, and crews who understood winds, water, and risk. The open question now feels sharper rather than foggier. Was Punt a single kingdom, a chain of ports, or a broad label Egyptians used for the incense lands? Scientific consensus is still evolving, but the evidence suggests the hunt for Punt isn't a chase after a myth anymore. It's a grounded investigation where reliefs, living cargo, and isotope chemistry line up just enough to show that Hatshepsut's famous expedition reached somewhere very real. If you want a real archaeological gut punch, it's this. In Sichuan, not far from modern Chengdu, people found evidence of a Bronze Age world so rich and so weirdly original that it feels like it should be all over the old histories, and yet the written record stays basically silent. Sanxingdui comes into focus through its objects, not through kings' lists or famous battles, and the first time the site really stunned the wider world was in 1986, when excavators uncovered sacrificial pits packed with bronze heads and masks, many with exaggerated eyes and sharp, stylized features that don't look like anything you'd expect if your mental picture of early China comes mostly from the Shang heartland. These weren't small offerings either. They were deliberate deposits of high-value material, bronzes, jades, gold, tusks, things that took serious labor, skill, and organization to produce, then were intentionally broken or burned and buried, as if the destruction itself was part of the point. And towering over almost everything in the Sanxingdui imagination is one artifact that still feels like a technical flex across millennia: the bronze sacred tree, nearly 4 meters tall, a branching, multi-part sculpture cast and assembled with a level of complexity that's hard to overstate. It's not just big, it's intricate, with layered elements and fine details that suggest a workshop culture operating at the edge of what bronze casting could do. And many archaeologists see it as an object whose sophistication can rival and sometimes surpass what was being made by Sanxingdui's contemporaries elsewhere. Decades later, fresh excavations and announcements in the early 2020s, including 2021, brought new pits and new artifacts into the story. And they didn't solve Sanxingdui so much as widen it. More large bronze pieces, more striking heads, more evidence that this wasn't a one-off ritual dump, but a sustained tradition with its own rules. The mystery has two sharp edges at the same time. One is cultural. Who were these people, and how did they build a visual language so distinct, right in a region that was clearly connected enough to have bronze technology and luxury materials? The other is historical. How does a society capable of casting monumental bronzes and creating giant statues end up leaving so little that later historians clearly point to by name? This is where the landscape starts to look like a suspect. One leading scientific idea is that a major change in the Minjiang river system, possibly triggered by earthquakes and sudden shifts in channels, could have disrupted water supply and local ecology so sharply that the center of life moved, effectively relocating the region's power and population toward what later appears at the Jinsha site. That kind of event wouldn't erase the culture overnight, but it could explain why Sanxingdui as a place seems to fold up and stop being the main stage. The evidence you can actually hold is concrete: the scale of the bronzes, the repeated sacrificial pattern, the sheer strangeness of the iconography, and the fact that these pits were hidden until the modern era, meaning whatever story Sanxingdui told about itself was never the one that became standard in surviving texts. The debate is still active, but the tension is already clear, and it's what makes this place so compelling. The objects insist on a powerful, organized society, while the silence around it forces you to treat ancient history less like a single storyline and more like a landscape with entire cities and entire identities that can vanish from the official memory. Somewhere around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean goes from crowded and connected to shattered and quiet. And the scary part is how many different kinds of evidence agree on that basic shape. For centuries before the crash, this region runs on connections. Palaces in places like Mycenaean Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and Egypt aren't isolated little kingdoms, they're nodes in a shared system. They exchange luxury gifts to signal alliances, they arrange marriages, they hire specialists, they import raw materials, and they depend on shipping lanes that turn the sea into a highway. Even the metals tell the story. Bronze needs copper and tin is the problem because it often comes from far away. If that long chain breaks, if ships stop sailing, if caravans stop moving, then tools, weapons, and prestige goods all start to fail at once. This is why the end of the Late Bronze Age feels less like one war and more like the moment the wiring behind an entire world suddenly burns out. In the ground, the signature is blunt. Archaeologists have documented destruction layers, ash, collapsed walls, smashed storerooms, abandoned streets in a huge number of sites. And a key point that keeps coming up in the scholarship is scale. More than 40 excavated cities show major destruction or abandonment in a relatively tight framework around the end of the Late Bronze Age. Even if every site doesn't fall in the exact same year, the clustering is intense enough to make collapse feel less like a dramatic metaphor and more like a pattern you can count. You can move from one ruined level to another across hundreds of miles and keep meeting the same dark band in the soil, like the region is repeating one disaster in different accents. What makes it hit harder is that the texts don't contradict the ash, they echo it. Egypt gives the loud, official version in inscriptions and reliefs, confrontations with groups coming by sea and land, battles framed as victories, lists of enemies as if naming them is part of controlling them. And the Egyptians don't just say invaders, they preserve names, Peliset, Sheridan, and others, small details that matter because you don't carve that kind of specificity into stone for a purely imaginary threat. But the most gripping written evidence is quieter and more human because it comes from places that lose. Ugarit, a major port city on the Syrian coast, leaves behind tablets that feel like a civilization trying to keep its paperwork going while the roof is already on fire. The famous hook here is the last letter associated with the king of Ugarit reaching out to the king of Alashia, basically Cyprus, and it reads like a desperate update to someone who might still be safe. My father, behold, the enemy ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. It's not just the words. The tablet was found in the city's destruction debris, in a context suggesting it was being prepared to be sent but never left, and that detail turns it into a frozen moment, an outgoing message that became an artifact because the system that delivers messages was collapsing at the same time. And once you notice that, you start seeing similar hints everywhere. Archives that stop abruptly, administrative tablets that end midstream, a world of bureaucracy that simply doesn't continue into the next layer. So what caused it? This is where the mystery stays alive, because there probably wasn't one master switch. Many researchers argue for a cascade, a perfect storm where several pressures overlap and amplify each other. Climate stress is one candidate. Drought conditions can shrink harvests, raise food prices, and turn already tense politics into open conflict. Earthquakes are another. The eastern Mediterranean sits on active faults, and a series of big quakes can wreck ports, walls, and storage systems, then force people into migration and raiding. Internal unrest matters too, because palace states concentrate wealth and power, and when supplies fail, that concentration can become a target. And then there's violence from outside, raids, invasions, population movements, becoming more destructive precisely because states are weakened and allies can't respond. In a tightly connected world, you don't need one unstoppable enemy. You just need enough disruption that the normal fixes stop working. If the grain ships don't arrive, you can't pay workers. If you can't pay workers, you can't maintain fortifications. If you can't maintain fortifications, raids succeed. If raids succeed, trade stops. And if trade stops, bronze production falters, armies lose their edge, and political authority collapses into a feedback loop. That's what the archaeological burn layers feel like, repeated breakdowns of security, administration, and trust, more than one clean, cinematic last stand. The Sea Peoples fit into this picture as both symptom and cause, depending on the region. The Egyptian sources make them look like coordinated groups arriving by ship, sometimes described alongside families and wagons, not just pirates grabbing loot and leaving. And while it's risky to treat Egyptian labels as a perfect ethnographic map, those names, Peliset, Sheridan, suggest Egyptians were interacting with specific groups often enough to recognize patterns. Now here's where the modern evidence adds a new, cautious kind of heat: genetics. In 2019, researchers published ancient DNA results from Ashkelon that showed an influx of European-related ancestry in the early Iron Age population, compared to earlier local Bronze Age individuals, and then a blending back into the regional gene pool over time. That's a very particular signature. It looks like real newcomers arrived, had children, and then, within a few centuries, became genetically less distinct as they mixed with local communities. Many scholars connect that pattern to the emergence of the Philistines in the archaeological record, and it lines up intriguingly with the Egyptian name Peliset, which is often linked to Philistines in later interpretation. This still isn't a simple DNA proves the Sea Peoples, because Sea Peoples is an umbrella label, and the Mediterranean is a big place, and migration doesn't automatically mean invasion. But it does support the idea that the late Bronze Age crisis wasn't only about armies and flames, it also involved real movement of people across the sea at exactly the moment the old order was breaking. When you put it all together, the reason this collapse feels like a reset is the aftermath. In parts of Greece, palace centers disappear, and writing in Linear B vanishes for centuries. In Anatolia, the Hittite imperial structure collapses, and the political map fractures. In the Levant, cities are destroyed and rebuilt in new forms, sometimes with new cultural signatures. Trade shrinks, the long-distance luxury network thins out, and smaller communities become the default again. That doesn't mean civilization ends, but it does mean the rules change, and for a while, fewer people are leaving the kind of records that make history feel continuous. There's no single consensus on how to weigh the causes: drought versus earthquakes versus warfare versus migration, and different regions probably had different mixes of pressures. But the evidence for the shock itself is about as real as ancient evidence gets. Ash layers across more than 40 cities, emergency letters that never got sent, Egyptian inscriptions that name specific enemy groups, and genetic data suggesting new arrivals on the coast. It's a reminder that even a world that feels stable and international can fail quickly, and when it fails, it doesn't leave one neat explanation, it leaves scattered ruins, interrupted archives, and a coastline full of new names. It began as a shipwreck, the kind of accidental time capsule the sea sometimes keeps, and then one corroded lump of bronze turned into one of the most unnerving objects ever pulled from the ancient world. Near the Greek island of Antikythera, divers recovered fragments of a device that, at first glance, looked like nothing more than gears fused into green rock. But once scholars started to take it seriously, and once modern imaging caught up, it became clear this was not decorative, not symbolic, not a toy. It was a machine, and not a simple one. Micro-CT scans revealed an intricate interior, around 30 interlocking bronze gears in surviving fragments, arranged so that turning one part drives multiple dials and pointers, like a mechanical logic chain. On the surfaces, there are inscriptions, small, technical lines of text naming months, cycles, and astronomical phenomena, the kind of writing you put on an instrument meant to be used, not admired from a distance. The core idea, as reconstructed by many researchers, is an analog model of time in the sky. It could track the sun and moon, show lunar phases, and map eclipse cycles with a precision that feels almost modern in spirit. But the really human detail is that it wasn't only about distant astronomy, it also tied the cosmos to the calendar people actually lived by. One dial appears to have been set up for the cycle of Pan-Hellenic games, including the Olympics, essentially letting the user line up celestial cycles with a schedule that mattered to real cities, real travelers, real crowds. which is a quiet reminder that science and society weren't separate worlds here, they were the same world. And then there's the part that still makes your brain trip, the design mentality. The gearing implies a deep understanding of ratios and periodicity, of how to convert one cycle into another, the kind of mechanical thinking many people associate with much later clockwork traditions. That's why it's so tempting to say it was ahead of its time. But the more interesting puzzle is what happened to this kind of technology afterward. We don't have shelves full of similar devices. We have this wreck, these fragments, and scattered hints in texts that complex instruments existed, but not the obvious family tree you'd expect if this was a widespread tradition. Maybe devices like this were rare, expensive, built for elites, and easy to lose, which makes the survival odds terrible in a world where bronze gets recycled and workshops vanish without a trace. Or maybe the institutions that could have kept that craft alive, stable patronage, long-running schools, a market for precision, were fragile, and when they cracked, the machines disappeared with them. What keeps the story alive is that the mechanism is still teaching us new things. In 2021, a team associated with University College London, including Tony Freeth, presented a new computer model that argued the front display could have shown the motions of the planets, Venus, Saturn, and others, using an even more intricate gear arrangement than earlier reconstructions could confidently explain. It's the kind of update that doesn't change the headline, but it deepens the astonishment. This wasn't just a clever lunar and eclipse device. It may have been aiming at a full moving picture of the classical cosmos in metal. Researchers still disagree on the details on some of the finer points because the fragments are incomplete, and every new model has to wrestle with missing teeth and corroded surfaces. But the broad evidence is hard to escape. This was a sophisticated geared instrument with astronomical inscriptions built in the ancient Greek world, and it proves that a certain kind of precision engineering existed far earlier than most people imagine. The most unsettling part is how calmly it makes that point. No myth, no legend, just a small machine doing math in bronze, as if someone long ago wanted the heavens to be something you could turn, watch, and understand. No one finds a Roman dodecahedron in a place that feels staged for mystery. It usually shows up the way real archaeology does, in a field, in a hoard, in a foundation trench, as this small bronze object that looks like it fell out of a different era's imagination. It's a hollow 12-sided shape, each face punched with a circular hole, and the holes are different sizes, like someone cared about exact diameters. At the corners sit little knobs, sometimes perfectly rounded, sometimes worn down, and the whole thing fits in your hand with the kind of balance that suggests it was meant to be handled, turned, used. The strangest part is how widely they're spread. More than 100 have been found across the former Roman world, especially in the northwestern provinces, Gaul, Britain, parts of Germany. So this wasn't one craftsman's joke or a single local cult object. And yet the Roman written record, which can be obsessively detailed about taxes, tools, and rituals, gives us nothing explicit that says, here is what this thing is for. That silence is what turns it into a real puzzle, because it's not hard to imagine Romans writing about it if it had an official purpose. The evidence we do have is physical, and it's stubbornly consistent. The holes aren't random, they're sized with intention. Many examples show wear patterns that imply repeated contact in certain spots, like it was held the same way again and again, or pressed against something, or had something threaded through it. At the same time, they're often found without clear military context, which makes the obvious weapon part explanation less convincing, and they appear in a range of find spots that include settlements and sometimes burials, which suggests they weren't restricted to one professional class. That leaves a cluster of theories that all sound plausible until you try to lock them down. Some people argue they were measuring tools, maybe for estimating distances or calibrating something by looking through paired holes. Others think they were used in textile work, like a gauge for knitting gloves, because the hole sizes could match different finger widths, and the knobs could help manage tension. There's also the ritual angle, because anything unexplained tends to get pulled toward religion, and the geometric form is eye-catching enough to invite symbolic interpretations. The honest truth is that none of these theories has a knockout piece of proof, no inscription saying "property of the guild," no workshop scene on a relief, no surviving instructions. Scientific consensus is still evolving, and in a way, that's the whole charm and frustration here. With the Dodecahedron, you have evidence that's almost overqualified, dozens upon dozens of artifacts, real manufacturing precision, real wear from use, and yet the meaning stays out of reach, like a word you can see but can't quite pronounce. It's a reminder that the ancient world didn't only lose big events and famous names, it also lost the everyday logic of objects, the simple, "of course this is what it's for" knowledge that never got written down because everyone around it already knew. Out on the dry plains of southern Peru, the ground becomes a canvas so large that the drawings only really click when you stop thinking like a person standing on the surface. The Nazca lines are geoglyphs made by removing the dark top layer of stones to reveal lighter earth beneath, and the result is a network of straight lines, trapezoids, spirals, and animal figures stretched across kilometers of desert. From the ground, a lot of it feels like nothing, just scratches and paths, because the scale is the trick. From above, the forms snap into place, and that's why they've always felt uncanny, not because they require magic, but because they require planning, repetition, and a sense of geometry that doesn't depend on seeing the final image all at once. The evidence for how they were made is surprisingly practical. You can reproduce the technique with simple tools, stakes, cords, and a team that knows how to keep lines straight. And the hyper-dry climate helps preserve the work for centuries. What keeps the mystery alive is why they were made and how the lines relate to the world around them. In recent years, researchers have used computer-assisted survey methods, combining aerial imagery, careful ground verification, and algorithmic pattern recognition to identify additional geoglyphs that are faint, eroded, or simply hard to notice at full scale. That doesn't mean an artificial intelligence magically found them. It means modern eyes can scan huge areas systematically in a way that humans alone struggle to do. Then archaeologists go out and confirm what's real. The other piece of evidence that grounds the Nazca story is water. Because in a desert, water is never just background. The region has an elaborate system of puquios, underground aqueducts and spiral access shafts that tap groundwater and channel it to fields and settlements. What's intriguing is that some of these puquios sit in the same broader landscape as the geoglyphs, and researchers have explored whether the lines and shapes connect to ritual processions, water ceremonies, or sacred geography tied to survival itself. Not every line points to a star, and not every figure maps neatly onto an aqueduct, so this isn't a puzzle with one clean key. It looks more like a cultural practice that combined movement, offerings, and landscape marking, repeated over generations until the desert became both a map and a memory. The debate is still active because different geoglyph types may have had different functions across time, but the real evidence stays firm. These were deliberately engineered drawings made with simple methods, preserved by an extreme environment, and now being expanded in the modern record through computer-assisted discovery. And when you put that together with the pukios, the lines start to feel less like random art and more like a society writing its priorities, water, time, and ritual, onto the largest page it had. When you zoom out far enough, human history stops looking like a smooth climb. It starts to look like a path with sudden drop-offs. One of the sharpest drop-offs sits near the end of the last ice age. The younger Dryas is a fast return to colder conditions that begins roughly 12,900 years ago and lasts about 1,200 years. For people living through it, climate change wouldn't mean graphs. It would mean seasons that stop behaving. It would mean plants shifting, animals moving, and reliable routines breaking. The big question is why it hit so abruptly. Many scientists explain it through changes in ocean circulation, especially a pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic. That kind of shift can cool a region quickly. But there's another idea that keeps coming back, and it's the one that turns this period into a real argument. The younger Dryas impact hypothesis says a comet or fragments of one struck Earth or exploded in the atmosphere. In that scenario, you get fires, dust, and a shock to the climate system. This is where the evidence gets both tempting and messy. Supporters point to dark, organic-rich horizons often grouped under the black mat label. They show up at multiple North American sites, and many are dated to around the start of the younger Dryas. On paper, that can sound boring. In the field, it doesn't. It can look like a scar in the soil, a thin boundary that separates two different worlds. Above it, one kind of landscape. Below it, another. In some places, it sits with evidence tied to the disappearance of mammoths and other megafauna. It also overlaps with moments when human tool traditions shift. That's why people keep returning to this layer. It feels like a line where something changed and stayed changed. Within or near those horizons, several research teams have reported unusual concentrations of platinum. They also report microspherules, melt glass, and nanodiamonds. Supporters argue these materials fit with a high-energy impact or an airburst. They also point out that similar signals show up across a wide area. The claim is not one strange sample. The claim is a pattern that clusters around one time window. Skeptics push back hard, and not in a lazy way. They ask whether these materials are truly diagnostic of an impact. They ask whether wildfires, volcanism, or sediment processes could produce similar traces. They ask whether the layers really line up in time across distant sites. They ask whether the results replicate cleanly across different labs and methods. This is one of those debates where the details decide everything, and the archaeological stakes raise the temperature because people naturally want a single cause. It's tempting to fold climate change, extinctions, and cultural shifts into one neat catastrophe story. The evidence does suggest the transition was real and disruptive. What's still contested is the trigger. Was there something from space involved or not? Scientific consensus is still evolving. The fairest way to hold this is to keep two truths together. First, the younger Dryas cooling is well supported and widely accepted as a real climatic event. Second, the comet impact explanation remains an active scientific debate. There are intriguing reported markers on one side. There are serious critiques on the other. And that tension is exactly why this mystery belongs at the end of the list. The planet keeps records in dirt and chemistry. Sometimes those records look like a clean answer. Then the science forces you to ask again and again whether you're seeing a cosmic scar or the complicated fingerprints of Earth itself. Thanks for watching. If you want more deep history like this, you know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.